London dreams of Boris Johnson have come down crashing. After a string of resignations from nearly 60 members of the government within 48 hours, they had a clear message that Boris is unfit to govern. His inaction on complaints of sexual harassment, policy differences, transgressions in matters of propriety led to Boris's exit. This is what he had to say after resigning.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place. Our Winian system will produce another leader equally committed to taking this country forward through tough times, not just helping families to get through it, but changing and improving the way we do things.
But who are the contenders that are likely to succeed Boris Johnson? There are 4 names who are the front runners. Here's a special insight from Times Now contributor from London.
We have Liz Truss, the current Foreign Secretary, who's very highly regarded in some quarters. She flew back to the UK today from the Far East, presumably to start assembling her own team. We have Ben Wallace, the current Defence Secretary, who has also attracted much admiration for his handling of the Ukraine crisis. We have the backbencher Jeremy Hunt, himself a former defeated leadership candidate. And then, of course, there are the finance ministers. Rishi Sunak, the ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer, an Indian origin multi-millionaire who resigned out of principle from his post just a few days ago.
And Rishi Sunak, who Jonathan was mentioning over there, whose resignation as Chancellor of the Exchequer triggered the avalanche of resignations against Boris Johnson, is believed to be a contender for the next UK Prime Minister. If it happens, he will be the first Indian origin man to be the British PM. Not to forget that he's the son-in-law of Infosys co-founder N.R. Narayanamurthy.
As British PM Boris Johnson has decided to step down as the Prime Minister of UK, his former Finance Minister Rishi Sunak's name is coming up as a front contender. Rishi Sunak, as an Indian origin man, has been in the British politics leading up to the charge of a Finance Minister's last term before he resigned, leading to the collapse of the Boris Johnson government. Rishi Sunak is also son-in-law of the Infosys founder Narayanamurthy. He's married to his daughter Akshata. If Rishi Sunak makes it to the next Prime Minister of Britain, he'll be the first Indian origin Prime Minister who will be taking the highest office in Britain.
Well, and we have some breaking news coming in. In fact, Times Now has also spoken to one of the potential candidate contenders and Tory MP Steve Baker. He says the new government could be formed by September.
Well, what's going to happen now is we need to have an election of the so-called 1922 committee that controls the process. They will then set the rules, declare the contest. I expect over the next 2 weeks we will whittle down all of the contenders to the final 2. They will then go forward to the membership of the Conservative Party in the country, who will pick the next leader of the party and therefore Prime Minister. That should happen by September. Remember that Boris Johnson saved this country from a major constitutional crisis after Brexit. He saved us from having a hard left government in Corbyn and McDonnell.
You're watching the News Hour at 9, debate number 2 on Times Now, Super Prime Time.
And for more on this, let's take this across to our guest. Joining us this evening, we have Professor Andrew Blick, who's the head of the Department of Political Economy and Professor of Political and Contemporary History at the King's College London. Professor Matthew Flinders, who's a Professor of Politics and Founding Director of the Sir Bernard Crick Centre of Public Understanding of Politics and President of Political Studies Association of the United Kingdom. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. Professor Andrew Blick, if I can start with you. Just about a month after surviving the no-confidence motion, Boris Johnson's government's fallen like a pack of cards. There have been a string of resignation over the last 72 hours, which have signaled a lack of faith in the leadership. Is this something that was just waiting to happen, given the series of controversies that we've been seeing over the past several months?
I think for a while now, people have come to the view that Johnson was on his way out, and certainly the confidence vote, although he won it, was far from convincing. And had there been a confidence vote, for instance, after the 2 recent by-election defeats, it is questionable whether we'd have won it. So the idea that Johnson was going to go, I think, wasn't that surprising. It's just a question of how exactly it was going to happen and what was going to precipitate it. And now we know. Although I'd add, he's not actually gone entirely yet. He's still in the job at the last time I checked.
Well, absolutely, and it will be perhaps 2 months before he is replaced by another Prime Minister in the job. But really, if I can come to you, Professor Matthew Flinders, one of the things that's of most interest to us here in India is the fact that amongst the top contenders, the top 10 names, if you'll have that, is the fact that there are at least 4 names of people of South Asian origin, 3 of whom are originally, or at least can trace their roots back here in India. What's the possibility, or what are the odds in your view that Rishi Sunak, the man who actually triggered off this avalanche of resignations, could be the one who the Tories pick as the new leader?
It's certainly a possibility. I think Rishi Sunak has had his career aspirations dented recently. There have been some issues around his wife, and to be honest, it didn't look good when he was included within the UK's 100 most wealthy people. And I'm not actually sure that Rishi Sunak wants the top job. He's been incredibly quiet. He hasn't been manoeuvring, and I'm not sure that he's really ready for it. And that if he was ready, he would actually get it anyway. There are lots of other candidates that are very, very strong.
Well, absolutely. So that's going to be a very important aspect. And one of the important aspects, Professor Blick, is also that with little over a year to go for elections, the candidate who's selected now will have to actually be one who the party believes will be able to win them the next election. And that's going to be perhaps the most important aspect as far as who the next face is.
Well, yeah, and I think that one of the reasons they weren't as quick to get rid of Johnson as they might have been was, although his electoral appeal was apparently fading, it wasn't clear who they could replace Johnson with, who could replicate the kind of electoral appeal Johnson was able to achieve in 2019. So that will certainly be a question. And if we come back to Sunak, he certainly looked like a very popular figure during the pandemic, when he was introducing measures to protect people's income, for instance. But certain events that Professor Flinders was alluding to have certainly dented his public credibility. So they will want someone who they hope can win for them at the next general election.
Well, he was also the centre, in fact, Professor Flinders, at the Partygate drama, for which he, in fact, offered an unreserved apology, paid a fine imposed on him by Scotland Yard for breaching COVID lockdown rules. Do you think all of these controversies are now behind him, amongst the ones that you mentioned?
For Rishi Sunak, I mean, I think he's fairly kind of clean and crisp, and he's got a very good public image, and I think he would be very popular with the public. I think the issue for Rishi Sunak is I just don't get the impression that he's got the fight and the demand to take on a top job like the Prime Minister. He hasn't shown any real willingness or desire to grab it, and to be honest, to get that top job, you need to really, really want it.
Right. And how do you see this facing off in terms of other candidates? Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, Health Secretary Sajid Javid. These are other names, Professor Blick, that are doing the rounds, and many consider them to be extremely strong candidates as well.
They are, all those people you named are contenders. There are 2 things to bear in mind here. The 2 electorates. There is first the MPs, who, as we've heard, have to whittle down to 2 candidates. There are lots of different factions within the Conservative Party, all with their own particular agendas, who will be looking very closely at all the candidates to see if they are actually going to deliver on their particular agendas. And some of them will be very clear about that and will want someone who do what they want them to do. And then they'll get down to those 2, assuming they get down to 2 and they don't somehow coalesce around 1. And then it's over to the members, and it's what the members think will become very important. Now, some polling of members has suggested that Liz Truss has in the past been far and away the most popular choice. So if, for instance, Liz Truss can get through to that last 2, maybe she'll get it. But first you have to get through to that last 2. And obviously we don't know exactly how the members are going to respond as well. So when we think about who's going to get it, those are the 2 electorates we need to think about.
Well, absolutely. And when it's a multipolar fight, it becomes that much more difficult to predict. But Professor Flinders, we have seen predictions saying that it could be by September that we get to know who the next Prime Minister is. Do you think that's a reasonable timeline? Could it be much longer than that?
I would be very surprised if it's much longer. I think at the moment there is still an element of questioning about whether the Conservative Party and the broader political system is willing to allow Boris Johnson to continue in post until September. There is still a lot of debate around whether there should be a caretaker Prime Minister who would hold the fort until that party election process is finished. Or I think what you can really be sure about is there is such concern about Boris Johnson still being in number 10 that the 1922 committee will move the election as quickly as it possibly can.
All right. And you think that's a possibility, Professor Blick, that the election could happen much sooner than we've seen in past circumstances?
As Professor Flinders just said, it's incredible concern that Johnson is being removed from power basically because he's judged unfit for office. So the idea that someone who's been judged unfit for office should be allowed to carry on in office with their hands on various levers for a prolonged period of time is a really difficult one, and it's damaging for the Conservative Party, and they will want to get it sorted out. However, it's still some complications in actually getting that resolved, and the members may well want to have their say, their choice between two candidates, and that has to be given some space. So it's a very difficult position that the Conservative Party in managing this succession.
Well, absolutely. And Professor Flinders, some of the key issues which, in fact, have plagued the United Kingdom are going to be those which will continue, which the government has also been struggling with, particularly in relation to the economy. How difficult really will be the job of the next man in that seat?
Well, the next man or the next woman in the hot seat will have a whole number of challenges. It's not just the economy. There's a number upon number of different challenges waiting. And of course, the great problem with Boris Johnson staying in number 10 is that, in effect, they're what we would call a lame duck. They'll be in office, but not in power. So big decisions about the economy, about taxes, about the cost of living crisis, benefits, nothing can really happen now until there is a new Prime Minister in place, which at a time when the public are yearning for sensible, clear, coherent, detailed government, it's not a great situation.
Right. And Professor Blick, what would you say in terms of difference of approach? What exactly would you think would be the different approach that the new incumbent would have in terms of what we've seen over the past 3 years, you know, when it comes to relations with other countries, or, for instance, UK's approach or support to Ukraine when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia war? What do you think would mark change in the next regime, is your guess?
Well, generally, when a new Prime Minister gets in, they do want to mark themselves out as separate from their predecessor. That's very common. They may, for instance, say, look, some rules are broken, some behaviour was bad, I want to draw a line under that. That is slightly difficult from the point of view of a lot of these contenders actually having been very close to Johnson, and only some of them only really discovering the day before yesterday that the way in which he was behaving was intolerable. So that's why it may be helpful for Sunak that he was actually one of the first to jump. But on the other hand, you could argue he was one of the misbehaving people as well, so there are problems there. So they'll try and set themselves out differently in terms of tone and conduct. But in terms of policy, I can't see any change on the Ukraine front. They will want to carry on with the same kind of policy of trying to offer military support for Ukraine in terms of supply. And in terms of other issues like Northern Ireland Protocol relations with the EU, we've got a problem in the UK in that policy is very much set on we have left the European Union. And it's going to be very difficult for any Conservative Prime Minister at the moment, I think, to be seen to be taking what might be perceived as a soft line towards the European Union. And all the contenders, such as Liz Truss, are very much posturing as we're going to be tough with the EU. So they're quite constrained, actually, in what they can do differently.
All right. Professor Blick and Professor Flinders, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening and sharing with us the perspective of that massive change at the helm in UK. Of course, in India, the question that we are looking at very closely, if the next man for the job could be Rishi Sunak indeed. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
The News Hour at 9 will be right back after the break.